It was just this past fall, and living so close to countless camping areas and trails meant spontaneous trips were second nature to me. I'd often find a trail on a whim, pack my gear, and head out the very next morning without much planning. This trip started exactly the same way. Quick, impulsive, and completely ordinary, or so I thought. When I arrived at the trailhead, about an hour from my small town, the parking area was empty. No cars, no people. I locked up my car, threw my backpack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The woods were as quiet as they always were, calm and familiar, with no signs that anyone else was around. My head was clear as I walked steadily down the trail, eyes on the ground, completely at ease, until I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of crunching and cracking ahead of me. I looked up and saw movement in the trees farther down the trail. As it got closer, I realized it was a man moving fast toward me. But when he closed the distance, something felt wrong. He wasn't jogging or hiking, he was in a full dead sprint. Instinctively, I stepped off to the side to let him pass, watching as he rushed by me without slowing down. The look on his face was unsettling. He didn't look frightened exactly, just off, unhinged. His eyes were glazed over, like he was staring straight through me, almost as if I didn't exist. I watched him for a few seconds as he continued running, then shrugged it off and got back on the trail. But after about 30 seconds, something compelled me to look back again, and that's when my stomach dropped. The man had stopped running. He was standing far down the trail, completely still, staring directly at me. I immediately snapped my gaze forward and kept walking, too scared to look back again until another 30 seconds passed. When I finally did, he was gone. Not on the trail, not anywhere, just gone. All I knew was that I needed distance from that guy. Being alone in the woods with someone acting that strangely was deeply unsettling. But as I continued hiking, another thought crept in. What if he had been running from something, and by moving forward, I was heading straight toward it? Turning back meant going in the same direction as him, and that felt worse. Besides, he didn't look scared of anything, he just looked crazy. So I took my chances and kept going toward the campsite. I checked behind me every few minutes, nerves buzzing, but I didn't see him again. When I reached the campsite, I set my gear down. There was nothing remarkable about the spot, just an open area surrounded by trees, no fire ring, no landmarks. Normally, the soft sounds of the forest would calm me. This time, the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like something was out there watching. I kept questioning my decision to stay, repeatedly telling myself the man was probably just doing sprints for exercise and that I was overthinking everything, though deep down I knew I was just trying to convince myself. As the sun dipped lower, the woods grew even quieter, nearly silent. Every faint rustle of leaves carried through the air. I cleared a small area and built a modest campfire, just enough to give me light once darkness fully set in. About an hour after sundown, I heard a sound that made my hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Footsteps sprinting through the woods, roughly 100 yards away. I couldn't see anything, but I knew those weren't animal footsteps. Each step was clear and deliberate. The running stopped suddenly, as if whoever it was had come to an abrupt halt, and then everything went silent again. The campfire, which I thought would comfort me, suddenly felt like a beacon broadcasting my location. Panicking, I made a terrible decision and smothered the fire. Instantly, I was swallowed by darkness. I stood perfectly still, listening, praying I'd hear whoever it was leave, walk away, run away, anything. Minutes passed, each one stretching my nerves thinner. Then it happened again. Someone sprinted through the woods, this time much closer and directly toward my campsite, before stopping abruptly. It felt like they were right in front of me. I stared into the darkness, eyes slowly adjusting until I could make out the shape of a figure standing partially behind a tree. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell they were looking directly at me, watching me. Not hiding, observing. It wasn't something a normal person would do. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman, but I was fairly certain it wasn't the same man from the trail.
That meant either multiple people were moving through the woods or this was what he had been running from. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I was terrified my voice would betray just how scared I was. We stood there, frozen, staring at each other for what felt like a full minute before the figure slowly backed away. After just a couple of steps, they vanished into the darkness, their footsteps fading unnaturally quietly, like they were barefoot and intentionally avoiding sound. The silence that followed was suffocating. My adrenaline made it impossible to judge time, but I think about 30 minutes passed without a single sound. I didn't move the entire time. When I finally did, I knew I had to leave. I blindly dug through my backpack for my light and began taking down my tent as quietly as possible. The light was weak, just enough to see what I was doing, definitely not enough to scan the woods. Whoever had been out there could have still been just 15 or 20 feet away. I didn't know their intentions, but I hoped that by leaving calmly and not acting threatening, they'd let me go. I started back down the trail, heart pounding. I never saw anyone again or heard more footsteps, but knowing how silently they had moved near my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That thought alone kept my adrenaline surging until I reached my car. I got in and drove out of the forest as fast as I could, not lingering for a second longer than necessary. It wasn't until the next day that I noticed scratches on my car door, and the passenger side handle was broken, as if someone had pulled on it so hard the latch snapped. That was the final push that made me call the police. My report led to nothing significant. I don't know if it was the man from the trail who tried to get into my car, or whoever or whatever was watching me in the woods, but that single night completely destroyed my love for camping. And as much as that sucks, knowing all the things that could have happened out there, I don't think I'll ever go into the forest alone again.
I was backpacking alone through a state forest, following a long, heavily regulated trail with designated campsites that required reservations. The trail itself stretched nearly 80 miles end to end, and while rangers did service it, I imagined they passed through only rarely due to its size. The campsite system wasn't just about organization. It was designed for bear safety, environmental protection, and keeping a record of who was out there and for how long. I followed every rule, reserving 2 campsites ahead of time, one at the 12-mile mark and another at 26 miles. Each individual site was spaced far apart, with the nearest ones at least a mile away. I reached the first campsite around midday, spent the afternoon resting, and realized I hadn't seen a single other hiker the entire day. It was off-season, so I wasn't shocked, but it was something I mentally noted. That night, I slept well, only waking briefly to what sounded like footsteps on the trail, sometime around 2 or 3 a.m. I barely processed it before falling back asleep, though I remember thinking it was odd for anyone to be out walking that late. The next morning, I woke early, made breakfast and coffee, packed up, and continued toward the second campsite. This stretch of trail was longer, steeper, and pushed deeper into the forest, so I didn't arrive until late in the day. The sun was still up, but by the time my tent was pitched and my fire was going, darkness was creeping in. Once again, I hadn't seen another person all day. At that point, the emptiness of the trail felt less peaceful and more strange. Still, I tried to appreciate the silence. Since I had no hiking planned for the following day, I stayed up later than usual. Around 9 or 10 p.m., I heard footsteps coming down the trail from the direction I had hiked in. When I turned, I saw a faint headlamp weaving through the trees toward my campsite. It struck me as strange that anyone would still be hiking hours after sundown, and I immediately thought about the footsteps I'd heard the night before. If it was the same person, I should have passed them at some point, but I hadn't seen anyone. Curious and uneasy, I kept watching as the light drew closer. Suddenly, the headlamp stopped. It appeared to be facing directly toward my campsite, and then after a few seconds, it veered off the trail and into the forest, away from me. About 20 seconds later, the light shut off completely. No movement, no footsteps, nothing.
It felt deliberate, like the moment the person realized they were visible to me or my campfire, they decided to disappear. That's when it stopped being just strange and started feeling genuinely concerning. Had they stayed on the trail and passed by, I still would have found it odd but manageable. Instead, they stepped off into the woods in the dark and killed their light right when they reached the edge of visibility. I stared into the trees for at least 15 or 20 minutes afterward, but nothing happened. Eventually, I reasoned they might have stopped to set up camp nearby, maybe running behind schedule and choosing to rest early. It didn't explain the night before, but I had no way of knowing if it was the same person. An hour passed, and for some reason, I still wasn't tired. It was like my body refused to let me sleep, and thankfully, I listened to that instinct. Without warning, I heard a soft crunch of leaves behind me, quiet, controlled, like someone deliberately trying to make no sound. It was close, far too close. I jumped up and looked toward the sound, but whoever it was immediately stopped moving. My heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the forest. Standing just 10 yards away was a man. He didn't look anything like a backpacker. No gear, no pack, just normal clothes. Even stranger, he didn't react when the light hit him, as if he hoped I still somehow couldn't see him. When I demanded, "What the hell are you doing?" he hesitated like he might run, but instead he started walking toward me. He smiled, and as he got closer, something clicked. I looked familiar. I recognized him, though I couldn't place where from. Then he said my name, greeting me casually like we were old friends. I knew immediately that something was very wrong. I was certain I had never spoken to this man or introduced myself. At most, I might have seen him in passing somewhere before. So how did he know my name, and why was he creeping around my campsite in the middle of the night? In a terrifying rush of clarity, I realized he hadn't just been following me tonight. He'd likely been tracking me for days, long enough to trail me all the way from civilization and deep into the forest. That explained why he didn't look like a hiker. He must have stayed far enough back during the day to avoid being seen, then searched for me at night when he thought I'd be asleep. As these thoughts hit me, he kept smiling and moving closer, saying my name again, sounding confused by my fear. I backed away and grabbed my bag. His smile vanished, replaced with a flat, emotionless expression as he asked in a monotone voice what I was doing. I didn't answer. I strapped on my backpack and started toward the trail. He yelled my name this time, aggressively, and his footsteps sped up. I ran. I bolted down the trail with my light off, relying on adrenaline and instinct, desperate to lose him. He followed for about 15 seconds, running behind me, but never fully left the campsite. I didn't stop walking for the rest of the night. While moving as far away as I could, I used my satellite emergency phone to contact authorities. Hours later, I met a park ranger several miles away from my first campsite and was finally safe. They never found the man. He had no car at the trailhead and no campsite reservations. For him to escape unseen, he would have hiked dozens of miles off trail in the right direction, an incredibly difficult feat without proper gear, even for an experienced backpacker. For someone like him, survival alone would be unlikely. Still, the most terrifying part is that I don't know who he really was, only that I'd seen him before somewhere. And if he did make it out of those forests, it means he could still be watching me. Sometimes I wonder if every time I thought I'd seen him in the past, he was already stalking me. And if I'm being completely honest, there's a dark part of me that hopes he never made it out of those woods.
A few years ago, I found myself between jobs with a lot of free time and no real obligations tying me down. Instead of sitting around, I decided to do something different. I rented a camper van and planned an extended road trip. When I ran the numbers, it just made sense. I could either blow my savings on a short, expensive vacation somewhere nice, or I could stretch it into 3 or 4 weeks of travel. I was never much of a city person anyway. I loved nature, and the idea of camping appealed to me. but I wasn't sure I was ready to be completely alone in the wilderness with nothing but a tent. A camper van felt like the perfect middle ground, a solid metal box, some separation from the outside world, and the ability to drive away at a moment's notice if something didn't feel right. With that plan in mind, I headed north toward the national forests and free public lands where dispersed camping was allowed. For the first couple of days, I didn't even camp. I slept at truck stops, just resting long enough to keep driving. Looking back, I think I was trying too hard to make my first real campsite something special, some incredible scenic spot, rather than easing into things at a campground where I could get my bearings. It wasn't until the third day that I finally had the chance to camp out in the wilderness. I was driving along a long, desolate road surrounded by nothing but public land for miles in every direction. I was using an app that listed campsites other people had stayed at, and I'd saved several spots to my GPS as backups. What I didn't plan for was that none of them existed. Every location I drove to led to nothing. No trail, no clearing, no campers, just empty wilderness. I spent over an hour crawling down a rugged, unpaved road, failing to find a single campsite, growing more frustrated by the minute as daylight started slipping away. I knew once the sun went down, finding any hidden trails would be nearly impossible. To make things worse, I'd completely lost cell service, so I couldn't even check the app for alternatives. My only option would have been to drive an hour back just to regain service, only to possibly end up right back where I started. So I kept going. Eventually, I barely noticed a narrow path branching off from the main road. I was already well past all the campsites I'd marked, and this was the first trail I'd seen in a long time. It looked even rougher than the road I was on, but the van could handle it. I couldn't confirm it was a campsite, but since it connected to the same road, I convinced myself it had to be one. I backed up, turned onto the trail, and slowly drove through the trees with my headlights cutting through the darkness. After about 5 minutes, the trail ended in a single small clearing, just barely big enough for the van. No additional paths, no nearby campsites, just me. For my very first time camping alone in the wilderness, that felt deeply unsettling. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, staring out into the woods as a heavy sense of dread settled in. I hated how isolated it felt. My gut was screaming at me to leave, telling me something wasn't right. Normally, I would have listened, but I was exhausted and frustrated, and I convinced myself that I was just panicking because I was out of my comfort zone. So I stayed. I shut off the van and moved to the back. It was already dark, leaving me nothing to do but settle in for the night. I laid down to relax after the drive, but only moments later, I heard footsteps crunching outside. Before I could even sit up, there was a loud knock on the driver's side window. I'd only been there a few minutes, so I assumed it had to be another camper. Maybe I'd missed their campsite on the way in. I walked to the front and saw a man standing outside, peering through the window. He gave me an awkward, forced smile, one of those not trying to bother you expressions. I asked if everything was okay. He said yes, introduced himself as Mike, and claimed he just wanted to say hello to his neighbor before it got too dark. Being new to all of this, I didn't know whether that was normal camping etiquette, but several things immediately felt off. I had no idea where he was camping or how he was so close to me. It was already dark, the sun had been down for a while, and the man himself was incredibly twitchy, shifting his weight and constantly glancing over my shoulder toward the back of the van, like he was expecting someone else to appear. That alone made my nerves spike.
I politely thanked him, trying to end the interaction. As I backed away from the window, I noticed he didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, watching me walk into the back of the van. I waited about 15 seconds before peeking through the curtain again, and he was gone. Immediately, I started checking every window, searching for any sign of light that would show me where he'd gone. a lantern, a flashlight, anything, but there was nothing. Every side of the van was surrounded by darkness and silent trees, no sign of another campsite anywhere nearby. I debated leaving. The entire situation felt wrong, but part of me thought that if I could just figure out where he went, I'd feel safer, like he wouldn't be able to sneak up on me again. I spent nearly 20 minutes circling the van, scanning the woods, seeing nothing. Eventually, I realized that if I didn't get answers, I'd have to leave anyway. Reluctantly, I decided to step outside. I opened the door and was immediately hit by how quiet and dark it was. Even the trail I'd driven down was barely visible. I stood there, slowly turning my head, searching for any sign of movement. That same overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, sending chills through my entire body. My gut was screaming again, "Leave now." That's when I heard a soft shuffling sound directly behind me. I rushed to the other side of the van and looked around. Nothing, but I knew the sound had come from right there. Hesitating, I slowly crouched down and looked underneath the van. For a split second, I locked eyes with the man staring back at me from beneath it. I bolted inside just as he shouted something, and the van rocked as he crawled out. Seconds later, he was pounding on the door. Up close, he looked completely unhinged, twitching violently, eyes wild and animalistic, filled with a savage intensity that reminded me of rabid animals. He punched the window with everything he had. I started the engine and drove. I could hear him trying to grab onto the van as I pulled away. The trail out was brutal, and the last thing I needed was a flat tire or getting stuck with this man chasing me. Multiple times he caught up and tried to break in again before I finally managed to put enough distance between us to reach the slightly better road. I drove for 2 straight hours until I reached a small town. I didn't sleep at all that night. I'm convinced that if I had stayed, or if he had gotten inside that van, I never would have made it out of that forest. I probably would have never been seen again. Even now, remembering the look in his eyes and the sadistic violence in his behavior after I found him hiding still terrifies me.